So when it comes to the so-called transatlantic slave trade and the notion of millions of Africans being brought from Africa to North and South America, we have to examine the events that were taking place during the time of this so-called transatlantic slave trade. So we know that the Moors ruled all of Europe. And in this painting, you can see that the Moors were fighting what is classified as the wild men of Europe. So we can look at the events that were taking place during the so-called transatlantic slave trade, such as the many wars that were taking place between the Moors and the so-called wild men. Now, after the white races had overcome the Moors, we are told that the Moors went back to Africa because the white races of Europe supposedly expelled the Moors from Europe, and we're told that the majority of these Moors went back to Africa. Now, you have to keep in mind a few things. White people of Europe were illiterate peasants with no last names, and they had no ships. The Moors had a fleet of ships, and their ships were taken by white people and used to transport all of the Moors out of Europe. Some of the Moors were able to escape in some of their ships, and they went to Africa. However, the majority of the Moors that were unable to escape were gathered by the white races, put into ships, and transported to North and South America, which was only a 10-day boat ride away from Europe. So we're told that white people of France and Spain are largely responsible for the transatlantic slave trade. And if we look at the same white people of France and Spain are the ones responsible for expelling the Moors from Europe. So did white people of France and Spain really travel all the way to Africa to buy African slaves at the same time they were expelling the Moors from Europe? Keep in mind that the journey from Europe to Africa and back would take 2 months. Each way is a 30-day boat ride. So do you think that they traveled for 2 months to transport African people from Africa? Or is it more plausible that they transported the Moors from Europe and dropped them off in North and South America, only 10 days away? The people who were put on ships and brought to North America by white people were not from Africa, they were from Europe. They were captives of war, and they belonged to the black nobility who ruled all of Europe. And I just want to show you guys some of the documents showing the white races of Europe. And we can get a better perspective as to who the Moors were fighting. These are the albinos and the beasts of Europe. And the Moors were fighting these people for hundreds of years prior to the so-called transatlantic slave trade. And one interesting thing I wanted to show you is that when you look at these beasts and albinos and how they have achieved what they've been able to achieve in just a few hundred years, keeping in mind that they were considered wild men just a few hundred years ago, and they had no last names. Many of them didn't even have first names. And I wanted to show you this because I found this very interesting. If you see here the wild men, and you look at the clothing that the people are wearing to the left, you can see here they're wearing this clothing to cover up their hairy bodies. So I found that very interesting. And something else I found in the British Library was one of the oldest genealogy charts, one of the first ones made for white people. And as you can see at the bottom of that genealogy chart, you see 2 wild men. So they're showing that their ancestry comes from the caveman. So that should give you something to think about, considering that just a few hundred years later, today, we have people like the Queen of England who claim to be of the royal bloodline of Egyptians and Cushites who ruled the earth. They even found the remains of a boy who was buried at Stonehenge in Europe. He was buried in Europe, but he actually came from the Mediterranean Sea in Africa. And he came to Europe 3,500 years ago. So that's in 1500 BC. So we're told that the Moors arrived in Europe in 700 AD. But here we have black people out of Africa coming to Europe over 2,000 years before the Moors arrived in 700 AD. And we know who arrived in Europe long before 700 AD, Akhenaten's daughter. So the last thing that I want to talk to you about is the slave names. So I'm going to use the name Wright as an example. So black people with the last name Wright can be found in North America, Canada, and in Jamaica. So the question is, did all of these black people from Jamaica, North America, and Canada have the same slave master with the same last name, Wright? And the answer is no. The last name Wright is one of the oldest names that can be found in Britain and in Scotland. Some records say that the name Wright comes from Britain, dating to 700 AD, at the very same time that the Moors came to Europe. British sources say the name Wright means worker, as in cartwright, shipwright, wheelwright, etc. In actuality, the name Wright comes from ancient Scotland, long before 700 AD. It means son of the right, or son of the righteous. So study your last name. If your last name can be traced to Britain, Ireland, Scotland, and other parts of Europe, and your name predates the time that white people ruled Europe, it means that you belong to the black nobility of Europe. And your ancestors were not brought from Africa on slave ships and given slave names by the white man, but they were in fact brought from Europe. And this is why it's no coincidence that the only time in history that we see white people gathering black people and putting them in boats is during the time that white people were expelling the Moors from Europe.